Hi everyone. This is a short little lecture to go with Chapter 1, Introduction to Neuroscience. So, what is neuroscience? Good question. In the book they say the quest to understand the nervous system is called neuroscience. Neuroscience is a relatively new study concerned with development, chemistry, structure and function, and pathologic characteristics of the nervous system. Of course, in physical therapy, it's really very central to what we do. Even people who work in orthopedics, I'm telling you, I've never had anybody walk in the clinic without a nervous system. So it's something that we all need to know about it. Neuroscience also involves a lot of other branches of science, and it's approached from a lot of different ways. So molecular neuroscience is sort of the chemistry and physics involved in neural function. So we do get into that a little bit in the class in terms of neurotransmitters, nerve impulse propagation, that sort of thing. We start on a very small level. Cellular neuroscience is all the different types of cells in the nervous system and what their function are. And the first chapter, actually, we will be talking about that. So we delve a little bit into that. As with every chapter in this book, I am going to try to help you link it to a pathology and help you sort of ground it clinically so you know why we care about this stuff. So there's a pathology for every system. Systems neuroscience, you go with groups of neurons that perform a common function like the basal ganglia or the brainstem or the somatosensory system. Most of this book, beyond the first 5 chapters, which is sort of the introductory chapters, analyze individual systems and how they function in the body with the whole nervous system. And of course, pathology is associated with those, and then we will talk specifically about how we deal with those pathologies in a therapeutic setting. Behavioral neuroscience is a wonderfully interesting area which we will not go into at all. It's the interaction among systems in the nervous system that influence behavior. Cool stuff, but we will not really be talking about that, except on the fringes when we're talking about the cerebrum and things with CVAs and brain injuries and how it can potentially affect patients' behavior. But we will not be going deeply into that at all. Cognitive neuroscience, also another really interesting field. We will briefly talk about memory, but we will not be going into the detail that is in the book about this. It's great stuff that, like, later on after you graduated and you took your board exam and you're interested, you can go back through the book and read about more of that information, but we will not be covering that in this course. So the chapter 1 is kind of an overview of neuroanatomy. Hopefully you remember all this from what you had in A&P. They talk about the 4 regions of the nervous system: the peripheral nervous system, the spinal system, the brainstem and cerebellar system, and then the cerebral system. The peripheral nervous system includes all of the nervous system structures not encased in bone. So all of your peripheral nerves, your autonomic nervous system, all that. The central nervous system, of course, is all encased in bone. That's your brain and spinal cord. Brainstem and cerebellar region and cerebral region all encompass the brain. So obviously that's important stuff. That's why we have it encased in bone. So they talk about the planes that divide the nervous system. They're exactly the same as we talked about in kinesiology, the planes that divide the body. Sagittal splits the brain nervous system into right and left, horizontal into right and left halves, and coronal or frontal into anterior and posterior. So same thing, and when we're talking about orientation in the brain, whether something's anterior, posterior, all of the same anatomical terms that we learn in kinesiology all apply in the nervous system. So that should be nothing new. There's some cool little pictures showing the different planes and different sections of a brain. I hope that all of you, when you took A&P, got to play with some brains, because boy, that's fun stuff, right? So anyway, there's just some lovely pictures in the book. When we start to talk about gray matter and white matter, they're visible distinctions in the central nervous system. Gray matter areas are primarily the neuron cell bodies and dendrites, which are bringing the information into the neuron. Information is integrated in the gray matter. So our cerebrum is largely made up of neuron bodies and dendrites, and that's where we do our information integration. White matter is the axons and the myelin sheaths that are covering them. That the white myelin has a high fat content, and that's what makes it look white. The axons are the nerve cell projections that convey information away from the cell body. Neurotransmitters and other neurochemicals are made in the soma, and they go out through the axon, and they usually are conveying information to other parts of the nervous system. So axons communicate with other neurons and with muscles and that sort of thing. So there's a little picture here, shows some white matter and gray matter in a coronal section of the cerebrum. And so the gray matter is our neural cell bodies, the white matter is the axons surrounded by myelin. So again, regions of the nervous system: peripheral, spinal, brainstem, and cerebellum, and the cerebrum. So the peripheral system, obviously, it's our connection to the outside world. The spinal region, there's a lot that travels through the spinal cord, a lot goes on in there, and some reflex arcs and that sort of thing. The brainstem and the cerebrum are largely in charge of all of our subconscious reactions in areas, balance and breathing and autonomic functions. The cerebrum is where we integrate and process everything, and where we have memory and make our decisions, and that's, a cool part of the brain. So in the peripheral region, we have two different types of axons. We have afferent axons, which carry information toward the central nervous system. For example, sensory information that you get from the outside world, touching things, that those afferent axons carry that information back up to the brain and tell you, hey, I'm touching something. And then that information gets processed in the brain and figures out what in the heck's going on. So efferent axons carry information away from the central nervous system. So once you've figured out what's going on, and you say, oh, hey, my hand's in the fire, the efferent axons carry the motor commands out to the muscles to pull your hand out of the fire. So we have those two sets of peripheral axons, afferent and efferent, and you should remember which ones go towards the CNS and which ones go away from the CNS. The peripheral components, one of the components of the peripheral system is the somatic nervous system. So when you think soma, it means body. So it's the nervous system of the body. It's our axons, it's our sensory nerve endings. It's the glial cells, which are our nervous system support cells, that are supporting those peripheral axons. The autonomic nervous system is also part of the peripheral nervous system. So there are a lot of nerve bodies, a lot of somas, entire neurons in the autonomic nervous system. Sensory endings, synapses, ganglia, all those things. Okay, so the spinal region here is what's encased inside vertebrae. So in this picture, the big white areas on the edges, they represent the vertebra, and then you've got the nerves going in and out. Okay, you do not have to, for this chapter, know all of this stuff in detail. This is really just a review and an overview, but we will go into this in much more detail in the spinal region chapter. So in the cross-section of the spinal cord, you have that gray matter that forms a shape that looks like the letter H, sort of, surrounded by white matter. The gray matter is subdivided into ventral, lateral, and dorsal horns. The dorsal horns contain the cell bodies of motor neurons, interneurons, and the endings of sensory neurons. So here's the picture that goes with that. The dorsal horn is the part of the gray matter that contains those motor neuron bodies. We've got lateral horns. So the gray matter, they're called the horns. The white matter are columns. Dorsal column contains mostly sensory information. The anterior column contains mostly motor information. So this will become important when we start talking about spinal cord injuries and incomplete spinal cord injuries. What sensations are maintained and which ones are lost in certain injuries. So right now we're not going to get into that detail, but we will certainly get into it later when we're talking about the spinal region. So the spinal region, its main functions are to convey information between the peripheral and the central nervous system, or the peripheral nervous system and the brain, and on some level to process that information. So, for example, in a spinal reflex loop, it doesn't even have to go to the brain to process that. It actually just gets processed in the spinal cord. You're conveying somatosensory information to the brain, and you're also conveying signals from the brain to the neurons that control the movement. So that all goes in the spinal region. Obviously, that's important, and hence it's encased in bone. That's kind of a theme for our body. Important stuff is encased in bone. Our rib cage and spinal column encase the heart and the lungs. Hey, those are important. The spinal column and the cranium encase the brain and the spinal region of the nervous system. It's important stuff. We have to protect it with bone. So the gray matter horns, the little H in the cross section of the spinal cord. The dorsal horns contain interneurons and the endings of sensory neurons. The lateral horns are the autonomic cell bodies. The ventral horns contain cell bodies of the motor neurons and interneurons. So remember, gray matter is cell bodies and white matter is axons in general. Okay, so the brainstem is within the cranium, and there are a lot of fiber tracts that carry motor and sensory information that go through the brainstem. That's sort of the bridge from the spinal cord into the brain. A lot of them end in the brainstem. A lot of our autonomic functions, regulating our heartbeat and our breathing and everything, the sensory information that comes from the rest of the body ends in the brainstem, and the brainstem takes care of controlling equilibrium, cardiovascular activity, respiration, and other important vital functions. So brainstem injuries are bad things because a lot of our vital functions get controlled in the brainstem, and obviously it's below the conscious level. So there's a little picture of the brainstem. We won't go into detail on all the little structures here. We will talk about it more in the brainstem chapter. The cranial nerves all arise from the brainstem, and they're numbered from anterior to posterior, 1 through 12. They are part of the peripheral nervous system, even though they are attached to the brainstem. Most of them have sensory and motor functions, although some are isolated to just sensory or motor. They're numbered according to the site of the attachment, anterior to posterior. This little chart right here is also repeated in chapter 14, which is the one about cranial nerves. This is all you will need to know about cranial nerves. There's all sorts of really detailed information in the chapter about it, but this little chart right here for the whole quarter, that is all you will need to know. That's all you will be tested on. That's probably all that will be on the board exam. Or there might be a question, for example, here's a great board exam question. A PTA is asked to test sensory response in a patient using different vials with different smells. Which cranial nerve are they testing? Well, we know right away they're testing cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory, because that's the one that does smell. So, I mean, just that is the level of detail you will need to know for cranial nerves, nothing more than that. So hopefully that'll be a relief to you, and there's not a lot of reading for chapter 14. Hey, the cerebellum is, there are 2 large cerebellar hemispheres. It's connected to the posterior brainstem. We're not going to really go into details about all the different peduncles Love that word. But and the function of the cerebellum is to coordinate your movements. Um, when I was in school, I was in a clinical assignment. I worked with a guy who had a cerebellar stroke. Holy cow, he had a hard time coordinating his movements. It was it was a very good illustration for me of how the cerebellum works, because when it doesn't work, it's crazy. So that's its main function, to coordinate movements. And of course, it happens on a subconscious level. We are not consciously worrying about coordinating our movements 100% of the time. I mean, when we're learning a new skill, of course, we're using our cerebrum too to help coordinate that, but the cerebellum is largely functions on a subconscious level. Here's a lovely little picture of the cerebellum. It definitely has a different look from the cerebrum. Kind of neat. So the cerebrum, also known as the diencephalon, consists of four main structures. Even though there's a lot of they talk about the nuclei, which are groups of neurons that do a common function. So the thalamus is a large egg-shaped one in the center of our brain. It being in the center of the brain, that kind of makes you think, hey, this is important. It's right there in the center. The nuclei and the thalamus, they relay information to the cerebral cortex. They process a lot of information. They figure out what's going to the cerebrum, what they need to pay attention to, and what they don't. So all of our conscious things that we're consciously aware of, they're all processed through the thalamus. The analogy that I like, and we'll definitely talk more about this in the cerebrum chapter, but the analogy that I like for the thalamus is the executive secretary for the CEO. The CEO is the cerebrum. So the CEO's executive secretary, she screens all the calls. She says what's important and what's not, what needs to go to the boss and what can they just handle right there. So, and what needs to be put off. So anything that's going to come into your conscious awareness has to go through the thalamus. That's important. So the hypothalamus is just directly inferior to the thalamus. It does all your subconscious things. It maintains your body temperature, maintains your metabolic rate, it maintains the chemical composition of tissues and fluids, and it largely does it through the use of hormones. It either releases hormones directly into the bloodstream itself, or it releases hormones that control other things like the adrenal glands and the thymus gland and some of the other glands in the body. So the hypothalamus is working on all subconscious stuff, all stuff that has to do to keep us in homeostasis. The epithalamus is posterior and superior to the thalamus. It also works on secretion for other endocrine glands. There's some of the things like it controls our wake and sleep cycles and some of the other things, and of course we'll talk more about this later. The subthalamus is inferior and lateral to the thalamus, and it's part of the neural circuit that controls movement. So we will talk about more of these much more in depth later. There's some pictures of where they all are. The thalamus is that big egg in the middle of the brain. A hypothalamus is a little bit below it. Epithalamus a little bit behind it. You can see those in midsection. So you can see the thalamus is that central structure. A lot goes through that. So the cerebral hemispheres are divided by the longitudinal fissure, divides the two sides. The surfaces of the cerebral hemispheres are marked by rounded elevations called gyri and grooves called sulci. So the singular of gyri is gyrus, and the singular of sulci is sulcus. So the little grooves are sulci, the rounded bumps are gyri. So the cerebral hemisphere is divided into 6 lobes. The frontal, which strangely is in the front, the parietal just directly behind it, the temporal on either side near your ears, the occipital on the back, and the limbic is more throughout the center, and the insular. The cerebral cortex is the surface. When we looked at that coronal section, it's that gray matter surface of the cerebral hemispheres. That's where we process all of our sensory, motor, and memory information. It's where our reasoning, our language, our nonverbal communication, intelligence, and personality come from. When somebody has a CVA, a cerebrovascular accident, it's the name for a stroke, the cerebrum, part of the cerebrum is deprived of blood for one reason or another, and so all of these processes can be affected. Sensory, motor, memory, reasoning, language, nonverbal communication, intelligence, and personality. So big deal. It's a big deal. And no matter what setting you work in physical therapy, you will work with someone who has had a stroke. It might not be an acute stroke. You might be working in an orthopedic clinic and you're working on someone who had a stroke 30 years ago. But in almost every therapy setting, you will see people that have had strokes, and it's really interesting stuff. It can affect all these different things because the cerebral cortex does so much for us. The basal ganglia is a group of nuclei in the cerebral hemispheres. This slide lists all the different nuclei. We're not going to go through them all right now, but we will in the basal ganglia chapter. The basal ganglia controls a lot of movement and motor skills. So in the basal ganglia, there are the cells, the substantia nigra cells in the midbrain, which produce dopamine for your body. That's what's affected in Parkinson's. Those cells begin to die off, and it affects our motor system really profoundly. So we will talk about that in great detail later. Cool and interesting stuff. The limbic system, it's not necessarily a centralized system, but they talked about it as a functional group of structures in the cerebrum. It includes parts of a lot of other structures, and it's really involved with emotions and the processing of memory, some types of memory. So the limbic system is really highly involved in what we do every single day. Just, remembering where you live and, processing emotions. And it's interesting how our emotions can affect a lot of other things. And that comes up in therapy a lot. You have someone who's physically doing really well. Maybe they had a total knee replacement or an ACL repair or something, and they're really depressed because they can't do the activities they're going to do, and that affects their healing. So even though we don't work directly on the limbic system, it's kind of interesting how it affects everything. So this slide shows sort of more details about the basic ganglia and the limbic system and where they're located. I certainly wouldn't expect you to memorize this stuff, but it's just kind of interesting to look at it. We talk about the support systems. The very last chapter in the book is about support systems. Cerebral spinal fluid, it's a modified filtrate of plasma, they call it. It circulates, it's created in cavities inside the brain, and it circulates to the surface of the central nervous system and is reabsorbed into the venous blood system. Dysfunction of the CSF system can cause a lot of problems too, and we will talk about that in chapter 19. But really important for nourishing all of those important neural structures. So there are ventricles, which are sort of like little pools located in the cerebral hemisphere. That's where the cerebral spinal fluid is created and circulated. We'll talk about the circulation of the cerebral fluid system in chapter 19. So the ventricular system continues down into the spinal cord and ends in the bottom of the spinal cord, and then that is all reabsorbed into the venous system. So this talks a little more about detail of the cerebral spinal fluid. All I want you to know for this chapter is what it does and where it is and its role in the nervous system, which is support and nourishment, and the fluid system gives it a little cushioning too. So here's some pictures of the ventricles. And the meninges are membranous coverings of the brain and spinal cord. So there are 3 layers the dura mater, which has two projections that separate the parts of the brain, the arachnoid, which is the spider web, and the pia mater, which is a delicate membrane attached to the surface of the CNS. So the meninges surround the inside of the bony structures, and they are part of the CFS system, and they're responsible for nourishing and cushioning the nervous system. So there's a little about vascular anatomy in the chapter, and we are just not going to go much into that. In the support systems chapter, chapter 19, we will talk a little bit more about it, but just obviously any structure in the body has to have a blood supply in order to be maintained, take away waste products and bring in nutrients, and obviously the blood supply to the brain is hugely important. If you don't have it, you're dead. So we will talk in the cerebral chapters about blood supply, and in the support systems chapter, and how interruptions to the blood supply can affect you. Big deal. This shows the vascular supply of the spinal cord, and so you can see it's highly vascular area. Really important that those structures are nourished. We will not specifically talk about Table 1.3, the arterial supply, until we get to Chapter 19. We're going to talk about it a lot more. Mostly in the light of when those particular areas are affected, what parts of the brain are associated with them. So there's a little short section about epidemiology in the in Chapter 1. They talk about the incidence and prevalence of disorders. It's nice to know when you're reading studies what those terms mean. So basically the incidence is the proportion of a population that develops a new case of the disorder within a defined period, and it's typically reported per 100,000 people. So they give the example of 40 adults were asked who had a new cavity in the past year. Only one new case was reported, so they extrapolate out to 100,000 and an incidence of 2,500 per 100,000. That's incidence, so within a defined period, new cases developed. Prevalence is the current proportion of the population with the condition, including both old and new cases. So when they say, you read things about Parkinson's, and they say currently about 1 million people in the United States are affected by Parkinson's. That is the prevalence. Although in scientific reporting, they will state it as the number of people per 1,000. So they would take the total population, divide that by 1 million, you'd have the number of people, per 1,000. So really just know that the incidence is new cases, prevalence is the current proportion of the population with the condition. So there's some pictures of I don't know why I put incidence and prevalence of disorders on this screen. Anyway, there's some pictures of the blood supply to the brain in this, and these are all all these pictures are right out of the book. Okay, so that is the end of the PowerPoint. Let's leave it up on a nice picture while I just talk about a couple more things. On pages 19 through 22, there we talk about neurological examination, and in the first chapter of the O'Sullivan and Schmidt's physical rehabilitation book, there's also a little blurb on neurological examination. Obviously, as PTAs, we are not doing initial evaluations. We are doing treatment after the PT has done the initial evaluation and come up with the plan of care. But it is a good idea to know what is involved in a neurological examination, because you may be asked at some point to retest some of these things, and you should also know if you get a chance to sit in on an evaluation. That's a really good thing to do when you're in your clinical assignments. So getting the history from the patient is really important. We talk about in the book, they talk about the speed of onset and the pattern of progression. So that is something that I really will want you to know for the quiz, is distinguishing from different speeds of onset. So obviously, is an acute onset is something that just happened minutes or hours ago. So like you just had a stroke or you just broke your arm, those are both acute. Subacute is the incident happened days or possibly weeks ago, but you are still having signs and symptoms over a few days or weeks. Chronic, you will go for weeks or years. So say you had a stroke 3 years ago and you're still dealing with those symptoms, that is a chronic issue. So with neurological issues, acute usually indicates a vascular problem. So like when you have a stroke, you have an ischemic stroke or hemorrhagic stroke. With subacute, it's often the inflammatory process that resulting from that issue. Chronic, a lot of times it's a with neurological issues, a lot of times it's a degenerative disease or something like a tumor that is going to affect you over a long period of time. In the cases of trauma, you usually know what the cause is, like you fell off a ladder and injured your spinal cord. With autoimmune disorders, metabolic disorders, the speed of onset can be variable over time. So, for example, people with MS, multiple sclerosis, which is an autoimmune disorder, they can have periods that are more acute and less acute. They can have relapsing, remitting. So they have a relapse, it becomes more acute, they need more acute treatment, and then it remits, and they're more into the chronic stage. So patterns of progression are things that we'll talk about with different disorders. You can read through in the chapter what is involved in examination and diagnosis. There's a really nice flow chart on page 21 about how a PT might take the history and the examination and come up with a diagnosis. So it's kind of interesting stuff, even though we don't really do it. What I would like you to know is to be able to distinguish speed of onset given a brief case study, and to just be able to identify what that is. For the first assignment, it's a discussion board, and I really kind of want you to talk about how you think a neurological examination might differ from an orthopedic examination, and also how you might think the course of treatment is going to differ between a neurological and an orthopedic disorder. So it's all very interesting stuff, and that is just our introduction to the whole course. So the other assignment for the first week is a little chart that you fill out with the different parts of the nervous system and a very brief summary of their function. When I say very brief, it can be in the form of a bulleted list or one brief sentence describing what that part of the brain does. So hopefully this was interesting and helpful for you. When you look through the chapter, I mostly just want you to consider it a review. You do not have to know any of these systems in detail at this point, because we will be covering them later in the quarter. Each chapter in the book covers part of those systems, but this was really just meant as an introduction. Okay, I'll talk to you guys soon.